Chapter 19. Surprises. Tucker's eyes glowed white-hot, and his fiery aura flared to life around him. He directed his aura backward, launching himself toward Lawrence at blinding speed, but just before he did, Jen saw him glance subtly in her direction. The corner of his mouth curled into a barely perceptible half-smile. Jen picked up on the meaning of the expression right away. Tucker had heard her concerns, and he did plan on following her lead. This was all a ruse meant for Lawrence's benefit. He meant to play the part that Lawrence expected him to play while giving Jen a chance to strategize without Lawrence realizing that they were even on the same page. So, as Tucker surged forward like a rocket, Jen moved. She made as if she expected Tucker's attack to fail, but that she hoped to use it to her advantage, circling Lawrence quickly but deliberately. Lawrence made note of her movements, but his attention remained on Tucker. His own soul flashed gold around him and took on the form of his translucent golden avatar arms. The armored, defense-oriented arm wrapped around his right arm, and his longer, clawed arm formed around his left. Tucker struck, but Lawrence raised his defensive arm to block. The force of the impact stopped Tucker's forward momentum completely and sent a shockwave of hot air out in all directions. Undeterred, Tucker moved to reach around Lawrence's defenses, but in the instant before he could, Lawrence reached up with his clawed arm, grabbed Tucker by the leg, and threw him at his ally. Jen, taking a page from Joe's book, charged herself with her anti-gravity soul and vaulted over Tucker, shoving him toward the ground to launch herself high in the air. Tucker crashed hard and rolled. Jen, meanwhile, hung high in the air, falling much more slowly than she should have thanks to her unique energy. Lawrence looked up at her and smiled. "What do you plan to do from up there, Gravity Girl? You have a range technique that you want to try." He raised his defensive arm, showing it to her. "Can you get through this? Because your friend certainly couldn't, and he hits like a truck. Figuratively, at least. To his credit, real trucks don't hit half as hard as he does." Jen didn't answer. She could recognize that Lawrence was trying to put her off balance now, too, reminding her that she didn't have Tucker's raw strength. He wanted her to question whether her strategy over power mentality would be enough to beat him alone. From Lawrence's perspective, Jen and Tucker weren't a team working together to beat him. They were simply two individual opponents, both fighting him at the same time. Jen decided to play the part a while longer. She pretended to wind up to throw an attack of some kind, and then hesitate. She painted her face with concern, and she saw that it had the desired effect. Lawrence grinned, just as Tucker rose to his feet again and renewed his assault. Without even looking back at him, Lawrence swung his offensive arm and knocked Tucker back across the court, where he slammed into the ground again and slid to a stop. In that moment, when Lawrence was both distracted and as unconcerned as he was likely to ever be, Jen finally made her move. She reached behind her back and traced a sigil in the air, spawning a small, glowing orb that she whipped around and tossed at her opponent. She aimed at Lawrence's torso, expecting him to see the attack coming and assume it to be a desperate yet harmless final effort, and try to block it. He didn't disappoint her, putting the plate-shielded arm between her and his gaze. In that moment, while Lawrence couldn't see her, Jen traced the same sigil in the air a second time. Another orb formed in her hand, and she threw it at the ground at Lawrence's feet. "Let's see what you think of this," Jen thought. "After all, I made it special for you." That wasn't entirely true, of course. She had been developing this new technique for quite a while now, but the impending confrontation with the Soul Takers had been exactly the motivation she needed to make the leap from concept to practice. The first of Jen's orbs hit Lawrence's avatar. Rather than exploding against it, or exerting any kind of direct force upon the arm at all, the orb stuck to the arm and opened like a flower, unfurling into a simple, smaller version of Jen's gravity sigil. Lawrence's defensive arm was wrapped in the same purple light that slowed Jen's fall, just as the second orb hit the ground, unfurled likewise, and the armored avatar arm was pulled toward the second sigil as if bound by an invisible chain. Suddenly, Lawrence's shield arm was too low to defend with, and Jen was barreling down at him, having reversed the polarity of her soul energy, increasing the pull of gravity upon herself rather than lessening it. Meanwhile, Tucker pushed himself back to his feet. Even though he and Jen hadn't planned ahead for this fight, the two of them had spent so much time sparring over the past week that they could read each other's movements perfectly. Jen once again reversed her energies at the very last second, landing softly only a few feet from her target. She lunged, and Tucker lunged from the other side. Just as they had against Joe, the two of them planned to catch Lawrence in a two-pronged attack. Lawrence reacted, of course. As his two opponents approached, he dissolved the arm that Jen had marked, breaking the sigil and freeing himself from Jen's technique. He also raised his other arm, the more frail offensive one, and put it in the path of the oncoming Tucker. Jen struck, then Tucker struck. Lawrence managed to divert Jen's attack, throwing her off balance, then kicking her away, but as he did, Tucker amped up the power of his Soul of Fire, and struck with all of his strength. Lawrence's offensive arm cushioned the blow, but the avatar was shattered, fragments of light scattering everywhere before fading into nothing. Meanwhile, Tucker's attack continued through and hit Lawrence in the fleshy arm underneath. Lawrence snarled, and muscular reptilian legs formed around his own, lifting him off the ground. He used them to leap far back from his opponents, splitting the blacktop with the force of his jump, and faced them both at once. His gaze was as fierce as ever, and yet, while he tried to hide it, it was clear from the way that it sat at his side that his left arm had been injured. Jen and Tucker had actually managed to penetrate Lawrence's defenses and strike a serious blow. The two of them moved to stand together. There wasn't any point anymore of pretending that Lawrence had succeeded in dividing them. He knew better now. His leg avatars disappeared, and he raised his remaining good arm, stepping back into a ready stance. A wave of intense pressure rolled off of him, and the air around him became charged with flashes of golden light. This time, rather than an avatar of any kind, Lawrence wrapped himself in a shining golden aura. He was no longer smiling or joking at his opponent's expense. Jen and Tucker looked at each other nervously. Lawrence, for the first time since they had met him, was taking them completely seriously. Tucker focused his energies, renewing his wild and chaotic fire aura. He had to fight to control his ragged breath, and even though Lawrence was hurt and it should have made him easier to defeat, Tucker had to fight back a wave of apprehension. Meanwhile, Jen wrapped herself in a purple soul, making herself incredibly light on her feet. Her heart was racing. Lawrence had already been able to keep up with the two dueling hearts when he'd only been playing with them. Now that he was giving them his full attention, she wasn't sure if she would be anything close to a physical match for him, injured arm or not. Yet Jen and Tucker didn't back down. They didn't hesitate. They were here tonight to send a message to the Soul Takers, all of the Soul Takers, that the dueling hearts weren't a group to mess with, that coming after them wasn't worth the risk. Letting anxiety and fear get the best of them would do nothing to further that goal, so they decided then and there to put all of it aside. Another moment passed, and then the two sides rushed toward each other, holding absolutely nothing back. As Sarah neared her opponent, Monty turned with a flourish. He danced along the surface of the water, the little circles of light appearing beneath his feet wherever he stepped, and launched a series of swift kicks at Sarah's torso. She diverted the first barrage to the side, then jumped, flipped sideways, clear over Monty's outstretched legs, and Monty himself. As she sailed through the air, she sent more soul out into the water below her opponent. The water began to churn. She gestured toward herself, and that water surged upward. The goal was to toss Monty into the air just as Sarah passed over him, knocking him off balance and giving her a chance to knock him back to the ground and hit him with everything that she could muster. But Monty wasn't having any of that. He planted both feet firmly upon the surface of the water, and the little circles of light merged into a larger one. The water rose up beneath it, pushing it upward. Monty balanced upon it, riding it into the air. Just as Sarah struck, Monty jumped upward, launching himself high above her. He spun, and his wand-like implement sprung from within his sleeve. He aimed it at his opponent, and raw soul built at the wand's tip. Sarah hadn't touched back down yet. She couldn't dodge, so instead she raised her arms and crossed them over her face and torso. Water followed the movements of her arms, putting itself between Sarah and Monty, acting as a cushion, just as Monty fired his blast. It scattered the water and carried through, hitting the defending Sarah with its full force. Despite her efforts, she was thrown out of the air and sent skidding to a violent stop at the far end of the pool. Lying there, sore and scorched, steam rose from where the water touched Sarah's arms, but despite being hit so hard so soon after the start of the battle, she was far from finished. She leapt to her feet, just in time for Monty to land once again upon the water's surface, his wand disappearing from his hand, and run at her. His fists glowed with silvery light, and he stepped in close, striking at every opening that he saw. Sarah defended as best she could, dancing from heel to toe, twisting around her opponent's strikes wherever she could, and diverting those that she couldn't. She looked for an opening to exploit for herself, but Monty was too fast. It didn't help that Sarah's feet were beneath the water again. Her shoes caught on the mud at the bottom of the pool, slowing her down. It took everything that she had just to protect herself. Sarah had to take the pressure off herself. She had to regain the metaphorical yardage that she'd lost with that first hit. She had to prove, once and for all, that she had so much more left to give. She wasn't some twig of a girl who would never achieve what the other fighters could. She was strong. She had already accomplished more than she should have, and she would keep right on accomplishing until she tore down whatever wall was holding her back. Straining, she waited until Monty struck with both hands very close together. She reached out and caught them both, spreading them wide and leaving Monty's torso exposed. Next, she pulled down on his arms and jumped, leveraging herself upward, kneeing Monty in the chest as she sent her soul out again. Monty staggered, losing his footing momentarily and stepping with his left leg into the standing water that he had so far avoided. As he did, Sarah found her footing once again on a thin layer of ice. She dropped low and sprung forward, flipping toward her opponent and lashing out with both feet, catching him in the chest once again. He was tossed back and lost his footing completely. This time it was his turn to fall into the water and slide to a stop in the mud beneath it. Sarah should have pressed her attack while Monty was down. He was in the water. He was at her mercy, but rather than finish him, she hesitated. She stood back and she waited, allowing Monty to sort himself out and see if he could continue. Maybe it was because Monty had done the same for her in their first heart-to-heart, but she didn't really know for sure. A few moments later, Monty stood up carefully. He stepped up onto the surface of the water once again. Silver light spread outward from his body, expelling all of the mud and water that clung to his skin or clothing, and he straightened his vest. Sarah rushed at him again. This time she went on the direct offensive, turning and twisting in tight circles, dancing from toe to heel, launching kicks and punches one after another, backed by the momentum of her turns. Monty stepped quickly from one newly formed circle of light to the next, flourishing out of the way of each of Sarah's attacks and turns. He kept mobile, trying to get around Sarah and attack from the back or the side, but she wouldn't let him. Wherever he went, she followed. Finally, Sarah's persistence paid off. She pushed herself rather than pace herself, and though she was soon out of breath, she succeeded in extending her reach just enough to hit Monty in the jaw. He spun on his heel, knocked off balance, and Sarah wound up for a follow-up strike. Relief flooded through her. Monty made no indication that he would be able to dodge or defend. This would be the turning point that Sarah needed. She reached out with her soul again and pulled more water from beneath her to wrap around her fist and form her icy knuckles. Her fist swung true. The attack was going to hit. It was inches from Monty's face when Monty dropped a whole head lower. He dismissed the circles of light holding him up and allowed himself to fall into the standing water. Sarah's fist sailed without resistance through his messy, spiky hair as Monty turned on his heel and struck Sarah with all of his strength, right in the center of her chest. What little breath she had retained burst from Sarah's lungs. She was knocked back. Monty pressed his attack, kneeing her in the obliques and then punching her several more times in the chest and ribs. She heard two of her ribs crack as she was sent flying backwards again. This time, she cleared the perimeter of the central pond and slammed hard into one of the nearby trees. She heard the trunk of that tree crack and snap, and she rolled quickly and painfully to the side before the tree could fall on her head. "The old man was right," Monty told Sarah as he stepped for the third time onto the surface of the water and moved to stand over her. "He really did help you improve. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. You still aren't any match for me." He almost sounded genuinely sorry, but Sarah barely even registered that. She took a deep breath, or at least as deep as she could manage, and pushed herself immediately to her feet. Her shoes sunk into the mud again, but she didn't care. She would not stop. She would not step down. As long as she could breathe, and as long as she could feel, she would keep on fighting. She relished the pain of her injuries. They rooted her, reminding her that she was still alive. She raised her arms and held them tight to her sides. Her entire body, literally her entire body, hurt. She'd never hurt so much in her life, and yet there she stood, ready for more, ready to make that hurt even worse. Monty looked surprised for just a moment, and then he smiled ever so slightly before taking up a ready stance of his own. Sarah, with one more sharp breath, charged forward. Despite her injuries, she was still able to approach with superhuman speed, parting the water along her path on merit of that speed alone. Though she was low on soul, she reached deep and swept herself up in a pillar of water, throwing herself at her opponent like a missile. She wound up, focusing everything she had left into one final strike. One way or another, this fight was about to end. Energy crackled along Joe's body as she unleashed a flurry of attacks. As she had before, Karen reacted to Joe's movements the instant that she made them, sidestepping Joe's attacks with virtually no effort. Joe saw the smile fade from Karen's lips, but she wasn't sure why. It couldn't be that Joe had surprised her. As she attacked, she didn't come any closer to hitting Karen than she had in the early minutes of their last encounter. In fact, it was that which surprised Joe, until she reminded herself that she had likely never seen the true limits of Karen's abilities. Karen was, as Wilson had thought she might be, even faster than Joe had originally thought. So Joe tightened her focus. She did as she'd practiced and trusted her muscle memory to decide her movements for her. Her extraneous movements lessened, and Karen wasn't able to avoid Joe so easily. Her eyes narrowed and she raised her arms. She deflected every one of Joe's attacks, one after another, caught one of Joe's arms, and turned, channeling Joe's momentum into a throw. This sent Joe sailing above the ground, tumbling through the air. Crashing would be devastating, so she threw her weight, getting her feet beneath her, and slid to a dramatic stop. As soon as she did, however, Karen was on her. She rushed forward and stepped in close, inside Joe's guard. Joe reacted without thinking. Karen thrust an elbow at Joe's abdomen, but Joe shuffled back. Karen extended her forearm, swinging her fist like a hammer at Joe's face. Joe sidestepped, caught Karen's fist in her hand, and pulled. Karen fell toward Joe, thrown off balance, her torso extended and exposed. Joe mixed her energies, seizing the extra soul that she generated with the entire force of her will, wrapping it around herself, creating her intense purple and black aura. She shuffled forward again and swung her knee upward at Karen's gut. Her attack should have been devastating, but to Joe's complete surprise, it never connected. Joe didn't feel any resistance at all as her knee passed right through Karen's body, and Karen faded away a moment later. Joe was stunned. Somehow she had been tricked into attacking one of Karen's illusions, but only a moment ago it had been completely solid. That was only possible if it had been the real Karen up to the moment of Joe's attack. Worst of all, Joe realized she had no idea where the real Karen actually was. Joe stepped back and turned slowly and carefully, trying to locate her opponent. How did she do that? She wondered. She was impressed by Karen's ingenuity, and had to remind herself that this wasn't just some competition. Karen was her enemy, and she was proving to be an even deadlier enemy with each passing second. Rather than admiring Karen, Joe should be trying to figure out how the other girl could do what she could do. If Karen could create illusions that were solid enough to be touched even once, then she could create illusions solid enough to attack at least once. She could create glass cannons able to increase her presence in a fight almost infinitely. If that were something that Karen could do, she would have done it by now. Joe was sure of it. Was it something like Monty's ability? In his first fight with Sarah, he'd shown the ability to anchor himself with soul to his vest and switch places with it in an instant. Wilson had said that illusions like Karen's were made of soul. Could she do that too, and switch places instantly with an illusion? If that was the case, when during the fight had she created one? Was she so skilled that she could make them even when she was off balance? If so, then this heart-to-heart was going to be even more difficult than Joe had dared imagine. Joe's stomach sank. She could feel herself falling deeper and deeper into danger with each heartbeat. She had to find her opponent. With a calming breath, she stopped turning, allowing her aura to fade, closed her eyes, and once again forced her energies to mix. This time, she allowed the life energy that she generated to wrap around her, forming her sparkling healing aura instead. Her few injuries lessened as she allowed her life energy to spread out around her. Barely a second later, she felt the life energy at the core of Karen's being push back against her own, leaving her with the impression that Karen was approaching her from behind. Joe opened her eyes. Her healing aura collapsed, and she turned on her heel to face her opponent. Karen was taken aback, and then her smile returned to her face. "It looks like you did learn a few things from the old man after all," Karen said, and Joe almost thought that she heard an air of relief in the other girl's voice. "That's right," Joe agreed. "Your illusions can't trick me anymore." "And let's be direct about this," Karen suggested. Joe's only reply was to step back into her back stance once again. Karen readied herself as well, and their battle began anew.